Good day. We'll begin today's presentation with a review of the long-term budget and the importance of balanced fiscal policy. We'll then transition into our policy recommendations, which constitute the bulk of our presentation. Lastly, we'll discuss our methodology and consider how alternative scenarios may impact our policy agenda.
Treasury's financial report of the U.S. government shows that in 2024, increases in receipts were offset by a larger increase in outlays, and as a result, the budget deficit rose to $1.8 trillion. Interest on the federal debt represented the largest increase in costs and comprised 12% of net costs. Turning to CBO's long-term budget projections for 2055, large primary deficits, which exclude interest payments, are expected to continue over the next 30 years. Including interest on the federal debt, total spending far exceeds total revenues in each year. The resulting higher debt loads will drive up the cost of future borrowing, feeding back into even larger future deficits and compounding the problem further. The rapid increase in federal debt is exacerbated by slowing economic growth. Rising debt levels will crowd out private capital accumulation, and growth in the labor force slows significantly, partly due to reduced population growth. In total, CBO projects that without further policy action, the federal debt will grow faster than GDP, putting the projected debt to GDP ratio at 154% in 2055.
Most economists agree that our current fiscal path is not sustainable, but it is less clear what the best avenues are for course correction, in part because of the mixed nature of the nation's fiscal challenge. Running large successive deficits has a snowballing effect, so restoring the balance between revenues and outlays should be a primary focus. But this is just half of the equation. Slowing growth also raises the relative size of debt, so addressing structural headwinds must also be a priority for policymakers. In baseline projections, where nothing is done to address the debt, the fiscal pace of government is reduced by burgeoning mandatory spending on both interest and entitlement programs. Discretionary spending as a share of GDP flatlines, implying that the share of fiscal policy aimed at long-run capital formation will fall, and growth is further diminished by crowding out as well as structural changes in the labor force. Reduced fiscal flexibility also makes the government more vulnerable to fiscal crises, such as pandemics and recessions. The victims of long-run shortfall from economic potential are the American people, whose well-being depends on robust economic growth. Furthermore, with any method of deficit reduction, whether an austerity measure or progressive taxation, the near-term impacts on ordinary Americans must be carefully weighed against opportunity costs of inaction, as it is ultimately their well-being that government exists to support.
To address the nation's debt crisis, we recommend decisive policy action. Our agenda is divided into two complementary approaches: balancing the budget and accelerating growth. In the first half of our plan, we ease tax and compliance burdens on vulnerable Americans while eliminating unproductive tax breaks that skew towards the top of the income distribution, the net effect of which is higher revenues without significantly decreased growth. Bearing in mind that revenues are only one part of the deficit equation, we also reform our nation's entitlement programs to reduce the excessive growth of outlays that threatens insolvencies, while maintaining the quality of essential social services that Americans have come to rely on. In the second half of our plan, we tackle the nation's slowdown in growth with investments in military R&D, transit, and environmental infrastructure. Notably, each of our growth-oriented policies is self-contained and doesn't rely on higher debt loads to pay for upfront investments, allowing us to begin phasing them in early on in our plan.
In recent elections, Americans have shown their support of candidates espousing smaller government. This is generally taken to mean reduced taxation and spending cuts while maintaining high growth. While reducing outlays must be an essential component of fiscal action designed to address debt, using those savings to finance even larger unproductive tax breaks exacerbates the issue. Spending reductions must be targeted at productivity to support growth. Otherwise, the effect of those reductions can be entirely offset by economic slowdown. We elect to take a balanced and long-run oriented approach to fiscal policy, reducing outlays on programs that do not contribute significantly to growth, while maintaining the integrity of social programs and supporting ordinary Americans with progressive tax deductions. We carried our theme of balanced progress into the political considerations with our package. Extensions of successful TCGA programs give political cover to the right. while progressive distributional policies appeal to left-leaning base. Other policies split the bill down the aisle. Our immigration policy considers Republicans' voters' fear of falling wages, and our carbon tax delivers on the administration promise to lower gas prices. Democrats achieved a political victory of their own with an extension of Biden's administration changes to the CDC. Progressive voters also support the removing unfair tax limits on Social Security. By appealing to both sides of the aisle, we make our agenda not only fiscally responsible, but also politically popular.
We'll now transition into our recommendations, beginning with policies that aim to restore the balance between revenues and outlays. Over the next 30 years, people over 65 will be the fastest growing age group in the country, putting further strain on already struggling entitlement programs. Even more pressingly, CBO estimates the combined old age survivors and disabilities insurance fund will be insolvent by 2034, resulting in a 25% across-the-board cut in benefits to elderly and disabled Americans. To maintain solvency, we propose two key reforms. Reapply the 12.4% payroll tax to earnings over $250,000 and create an additional bend point at the 70th percentile of earners and gradually lower primary insurance amounts for those above the new bend. Because current taxable maximum is indexed to wage growth, implementing the tax on earnings above the $250,000 threshold creates a natural phase-in, eventually subjecting all eligible earnings to tax. Notably, the disproportionate impact of the tax on high earners will fall over time as incomes rise due to inflation. Even with this reform, the long-term trajectory of benefits is unsustainable. By introducing an additional bend point to PIA calculations, we prioritize those who depend the most on the program. Taken together, the proposals would extend Social Security solvency through the typical 75-year period.
Within the Medicare Advantage program, beneficiaries receive a risk score reflecting their health conditions, and insurers are paid more for providing services to beneficiaries with a higher risk score. This incentivizes insurers to code higher risk scores, usually through health risk assessment or HRAs. This creates systematically higher risk scores for enrollees in Medicare Advantage versus the fee-for-service program known as coding intensity. To reduce bias in risk scoring, we propose using an additional year of diagnostic data in the calculation of risk scores for Medicare Advantage enrollees and excluding HRAs from their risk scores. This would reduce spending on Medicare Advantage by providing fewer supplemental benefits and bring risk scoring in line with the fee-for-service program, reducing transfers to the program each year.
In 2024, 41% of all federal outlays were accounted for by Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. For each of these programs, annual cost of living adjustments are indexed to changes in the Consumer Price Index, which contains known biases that overstate the impact of price increases on consumer well-being. As a result, cost of living adjustments are often higher than is needed. To address this long-run inefficiency in the balance of our social programs, we propose indexing future cost of living adjustments by the chained CPI, which offers a less biased and more accurate measure of changes in the cost of living compared to the traditional CPI. Annual inflation as measured by chained CPI is on average a quarter point lower than annual inflation as measured by the traditional CPI. This adjustment would reduce the federal spending by approximately $691 billion over the next 30 years, while maintaining the quality of essential social services.
With looming expiration of many provisions of the 2017 TCJA at the end of this year, tax policy is at a crossroads. Without legislative intervention, millions of Americans will face higher tax liabilities and increased compliance burdens. According to the Tax Foundation, the expiration of the TCJA's individual tax cuts will primarily impact middle-income households. Furthermore, if the standard deduction returns to pre-TCJA levels, more households will shift towards itemizing deductions, raising compliance costs. We propose a twofold solution. Permanently increase the standard deduction to $19,500 and extend the CDC. Research from the Penn Wharton budget model estimates that middle-income households will benefit the most from extending the standard deduction. Most Americans for whom itemization saves less than $19,000 will see real savings and increased propensity to invest. While low-income households may not fully benefit from the standard deduction increase due to lower taxable income, they will receive substantial relief through the refundable CDC. Studies by the Congressional Research Service highlight how CTC improves college enrollment, promotes long-term economic mobility, and hedges unprotected families from tax hikes.
While on net, TCJA reduced revenues with lower tax rates, it offset some of these cuts with limits on inequitable itemized tax deductions. According to the Peterson Foundation, itemized deductions disproportionately favor the top quintile of earners and make the tax code more regressive. Drawing on the lessons learned from studying the effects of TCJA, as well as research by Owen Zidar, which shows raising tax burdens for high-income individuals has little to no effect on long-run growth, we propose changes to 3 major deductions. Firstly, we recommend repealing the charitable contributions deduction, which disproportionately benefits high earners. Second, we propose permanently capping the state and local tax deduction at $5,780 for single filers and $11,750 for married filers. Limiting the SALT deduction reduces benefits for high-income households, promotes state-level fiscal responsibility, and ensures that federal tax relief is not disproportionately skewed toward high-tax states and wealthy taxpayers. Lastly, we recommend replacing the mortgage interest deduction with a 15% tax credit on annual mortgage interest payments. The MID disproportionately benefits established homeowners and incentivizes purchasing homes beyond filers' financial means, inflating real estate prices. A flat 15% tax credit on mortgage interest will extend relief to all homeowners, including those who take the standard deduction, making itemization less favorable. Taken as a package, our tax reforms create a simple, equitable, and sustainable tax system by shifting tax breaks from the wealthiest Americans towards those at the bottom of the income distribution, who benefit the most from them.
We'll now shift our focus towards policies that address the nation's stagnating economic growth projections. The U.S. is facing a looming population crisis. Deaths are expected to exceed births by 2033, with subsequent population growth stemming from net immigration. The obvious solution, increased immigration, has proven itself a political liability in recent years, with many Americans fearing that higher immigration levels will reduce their wages and job mobility. Balancing these two concerns, population growth on one hand and political challenges on the other, we suggest a measured approach. Raise the annual cap on H-1B visas from 85,000 to 100,000 and continue with increases of 10,000 in subsequent years until 2035, at which point the program's annual cap will be 200,000. The H-1B program allows highly educated workers into the U.S. for up to 6 years. By targeting high-skilled workers, we ensure that population growth supports per capita productivity growth, offsetting the potential for downward pressure on wages. Furthermore, the fraction of H-1B workers who ultimately become citizens have a net positive fiscal impact, contributing more to revenues than they've received from federal spending.
Applying recent estimates of the social cost of carbon to CBU's projections for CO2 emissions in 2034 reveal a combined public and private cost of nearly $600 billion to U.S. citizens. In a similar vein, the Highway Trust Fund, which maintains America's highways and mass transit systems, is expected to be insolvent by 2028, potentially leading to a decline in the basic infrastructure that supports American commuters. In both cases, a failure of government to act will result in the depreciation of an essential public good and ultimately a shortfall in long-run productive capacity. We recommend a two birds, one stone approach, a $25 tax per metric ton of carbon increasing at a rate of 2% each year, with revenues primarily directed to making up the HTF's shortfalls. At the same time, we would phase out the federal gas tax at a rate of 2 cents per year. Revenues from the gas tax have fallen with the rise of electric vehicles, and shifting to a carbon tax modernizes the revenue streams of the HTF. After an initial decline, CO2 emissions will stabilize at a more socially optimal level as firms evaluate the marginal benefits of emissions more carefully. The solvency of the HTF and quality of American infrastructure is thus maintained by the carbon tax, even as firms may change their emissions patterns. After making up HTF shortfalls, we recommend that the additional revenues be invested in renewable energy implementation programs via the Department of Energy. Recent IMF research shows the renewable energy investments yield a higher fiscal multiplier and raise productive capacity relative to spending on traditional fossil fuels-based energy investments, because green energy production is more labor-intensive and thus has a smaller crowding out effect.
In 2025, the Department of Defense budget represented 49% of all discretionary spending, and by 2034, nearly 70% of DoD's budget will be spent between maintenance and personnel, with very little federal funds going towards the R&D that distinguishes the U.S. military on the global stage. To maintain U.S. military competitiveness in an era of increasing global political pressure, we recommend a two-part approach. First, cancel DoD's planned construction of a new Ford aircraft carrier in 2030, and retire the military's F-22 fleet in 2026, favoring their stealth aircraft. Second, reinvest the funds in research related to digital security through DARPA. Historically, military research has provided funding for ideas ahead of their time, giving America a competitive advantage in the technological security race, an issue of growing priority. By shifting the composition of DoD spending towards R&D, we preserve our competitive edge in an increasingly fractured global landscape.
In modeling the aggregate impact of our policies, we considered the extent to which lowering the relative size of debt may result in a crowding-in effect, reducing future interest rates. We base our calculation of the 5-year forward debt sensitivity of interest, or DISR, on a 2024 paper by Nouveau, Fiddick, and Schaefer from the CBO, which showed that a 1% change in the debt-to-GDP ratio leads to a 2 basis point response in the 5-year ahead interest rate on 10-year Treasury notes. We calculate this effect using as baseline CBO's long-run 10-year T-note and debt-to-GDP ratio projections. We also measure the projected ratio between the 10-year Treasury note and interest on the federal debt in each year of our forecast. This allows us to adjust for the composition of federal debt, which would usually carry lower interest rates than the 10-year alone, as it includes shorter maturity liabilities. The result of these modeling assumptions is that we capture the effect of a lower debt load on net interest payments, reducing our debt-to-GDP ratio in 2055 by an additional 23%. An added benefit of directly calculating the DISR effect is that we show our policy agenda would reduce nominal rates on the 10-year T-note, lowering them close to levels seen in the second half of the 2010s. In our current analysis, we do not account for the expansionary or inflationary effects of this revised rate path, as these heavily depend on long-run projections for R-star and trend growth, which our policy actions are designed to alter. In subsequent analyses, we hope to provide a more accurate aggregate estimate based on estimates of these factors from other sources.
As previously discussed, a balanced approach to fiscal policy gives the government greater fiscal space to respond to a crisis. To that end, and influenced by the CBO's alternative baselines, we produced an alternative scenario for the path of growth in the near term. We aim to give a sense of how rapid policy action to address the national debt can increase fiscal flexibility. In our alternative scenario, we introduce a U-shaped recession where the nominal growth rate slows in 2025 and the economy contracts in 2026, before gradually returning to its baseline projection in 2029. We assume the Federal Reserve responds with rate cuts in the latter half of 2025 through 2026, with reductions in short rates, lowering the level of the yield curve and reducing the projected 10-year rate by 100 basis points in 2026. Under this new specification, the baseline debt-to-GDP ratio in 2055 rises to 172%, while our policy agenda maintains it at roughly the current level with a 2025 ratio of 102%. With no policy action, the 2055 debt-to-GDP ratio raises 18% with the recession shock, while with policy action, the recession shock only causes a rise of 11%, demonstrating the robustness of our reforms.
Our final projections show that our policy agenda would lower debt to GDP ratio in 2055 by 88% by accelerating growth, reducing outlays, and raising revenues. Our plan also reforms a regressive tax code, safeguards entitlement programs, and addresses both the climate and population crisis. The result is a nation poised for success, a citizenry both healthy and productive, and a federal budget designed to support Americans well into the future. Thank you for your consideration.